Little fairies. I think there's part of all of us that would like to believe they're real, right? Well, after hearing these stories, maybe you'll keep your eyes peeled the next time you happen to be strolling along the Irish countryside. These are real fairy sightings that remain unexplained. One intriguing account of fairy sightings comes from the early 20th century in Ireland. Most of these stories come out of Ireland, unsurprisingly. The story was recounted by an American anthropologist named Walter Evans Wentz. He'd been doing research into Irish fairy lore and ended up speaking to a 73-year-old man named Neil Colton, who claimed that he'd had a real encounter with fairies in 1853 when he was young. According to Neil Colton, he, his brother, and his cousin were gathering blueberries behind their family home when they started to hear music. To their astonishment, they discovered a group of 6 to 8 small people dancing in a circle just a few dozen yards away. Neil described how once he noticed them, a little woman dressed entirely in red rushed toward them. She struck Neil's cousin in the face with what seemed to be a small green plant. The 3 youngsters immediately fled back into the house, but Neil's cousin passed out shortly after they got inside. His father quickly called for Father Ryan, a local priest, who performed a blessing and struck the cousin with a stole, and miraculously she woke back up. A very strange and outlandish story, but prepare yourself, it doesn't get any less strange and outlandish from here on out. This one's fun because it's a fairly recent case, 2005, recent compared to 1853 anyway. In the summer of 2005 in Chicora, Pennsylvania, a man going simply as JF shared a story to the press about a very strange encounter. He and his girlfriend were hanging out with friends at a house surrounded by dense woods. After enjoying the sunset from the back deck, the group continued to relax and chat as the sun continued going down, and suddenly they heard a commotion coming from the potted plants near one of the last small patches of sun. Everyone turned to see what was causing the noise, and out of nowhere, a tiny figure shot up into the air. The creature was about 12 inches tall and had a human-like head with long, pointy ears. As it hovered in mid-air, wings unfurled from the thing's back, but they weren't the type of wings you typically think of when you picture a fairy. They were more like a bat's wings. After a few moments of hovering over the group, the being fluttered away like a butterfly, disappearing into the dark woods. The group was understandably completely awestruck, sitting frozen in silence for a bit before looking at each other and being like, did we just see a fairy? From Reddit user The Pie Wizard comes a story I'm going to call The Cloaked Figure. I was in Tomnahurich Hill Cemetery in Inverness, Scotland in 2018. I heard a woman's voice whisper my name in my left ear while I was alone at the top of the hill. Later, I found out from a local bartender that the hill is known as a fairy fortress. Exactly 1 week later, I was in England and had the only instance of sleep paralysis I've ever had. A shadow figure stepped out of a bright light at the foot of my bed. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like a Dementor without the cloak. No facial features, maybe about 5 feet tall. The skin on it had texture, lines and such, and was dark gray and black in color. It sat down next to me and leaned in close to my left ear. I didn't hear anything, but was finally able to move at that point, and it got visibly startled and backed away into the darkness, not the same direction of the light. Needless to say, I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I felt uneasy for the remainder of my time in Europe, about a month. As soon as the plane took off, I felt a lot less heavy and haven't experienced anything like it since. In May of 1913 in Farmsville, Texas, 3 brothers, Clyde, Sid, and Silby Latham, were out in the fields chopping cotton. As they were working, their 2 dogs suddenly started going wild, barking uncontrollably, but there was no one there, at least not by the looks of it. The boys went to check out the commotion and were shocked to find what they described as a tiny green man standing just 18 inches tall. The little guy was dressed in what looked like a green rubber suit. Before they could fully process what they were looking at, the dogs attacked the tiny guy and sadly just ripped him to pieces. The brothers would head back to the scene the next day to verify what they'd seen and make sure they hadn't lost their minds, but when they returned, there was no sign of the green man's remains. Decades later, in 1978, Larry Sessions from the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History took an interest in the case and interviewed Silby. He was understandably pretty skeptical of this story, but Silby was adamant that everything he said was true and that he and his brothers had not in any way mistaken a large frog for an 18-inch man in a green suit. What the f am I talking about? It's like, wow. In 1948, a young boy named E.G.M. Reynolds from London was on summer holidays in Horsham. One night while setting rabbit traps, Reynolds had a bizarre encounter. Under the moonlight, he spotted a small, hairy figure coming out from a blackberry bush. Reynolds described it as a tiny man standing about 18 inches tall, once again, covered in hair with a bare face that had a leathery appearance and unusually long arms. It sounds like a monkey to me, but when Reynolds shared his experience with the people he was staying with, they just laughed him off. But that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, Reynolds saw the same hairy man again, this time in broad daylight and in a completely different spot. The little guy was just casually strolling across a lawn, and Reynolds decided he was just gonna keep quiet about this whole thing, this whole second sighting, until coming out with his story to the public when he was older. In the early 90s, a young man named Brian Collins claimed to have spotted two fairy-like beings. He'd been vacationing on the Aran Islands just off the coast of County Donegal, Ireland, and one morning while he was out for a walk, he came across two figures, no taller than 3.5 feet. They were fishing from a bank that overlooked the water. They were chatting and laughing in Irish Gaelic. As soon as the small creatures noticed Brian, though, they dashed off, jumping over the bank and disappearing from sight. Brian tried to follow them, but they were gone. He did find a small pipe one of them had left behind, though, and according to Brian, this pipe vanished from a locked drawer where he'd stashed it away. He was determined to spot the little men again, though, and this time he wanted evidence. He went back to the same spot the following day, armed with a camera and a tape recorder. Again, this was the early 90s. This time he took a photo and recorded their conversation. He raced back home to review what he'd recorded, but there was nothing on the recording other than the sound of water and a light breeze. He later looked at the picture he developed, and there was no sign of the little people there either. In August of 1862 in Brecon, Wales, David Evans and Evan Lewis were heading back from a timber haul when they decided to take a break near a farm. As they sat there relaxing, Evans suddenly spotted something on a hill nearby. It looked like a line of around 50 figures making their way up the slope. Once the figures reached the top of the hill, they started dancing in a large circle. Evans and Lewis just sat there watching as the figures danced closer and closer to the center of the circle, only to disappear into the ground one by one. Then they reappeared the same way, one after another, dancing another round before vanishing back into the hill, and this time they didn't come back out. Evans and Lewis later bumped into an old man on the side of the road, and they got to talking and ended up sharing their story with the man. The old guy wasn't sure what to make of what they told him, but he did mention that his own grandfather had told stories about fairies dancing in the area. In 1884, on the Isle of Man, a man named William Martin was vacationing when he came across a mail car driver who ended up telling him a very unusual story. According to the driver, one evening while collecting mail, he had a run-in with a group of small fairy-like creatures. They'd been dressed in bright red, each carrying a lantern. As the driver was making his way back, just 6 miles from his final stop, these mischievous fairies stopped the cart's horse, tossed all the mailbags onto the road, and then began dancing around them. The driver tried to get the bags back onto the cart, but every time he did, they just kept tossing them back out. This went on all night, and by the time he finally got the bags back on the cart and reached his destination, he was hours late and incredibly frustrated. That's a very bizarre version of the dog ate my homework. This next case was shared by a woman named Mrs. G. Herbert in a 1928 issue of the Transactions of the Devonshire Association. Back in 1897, when she was just a young girl, she had a strange encounter in Dartmoor, England. While out for a walk, she spotted a tiny man, around 18 inches tall, hiding under an overhanging boulder. He wore a pointed hat that curved slightly forward and was wearing what she described as little short knicker things. Before she could fully grasp what she was seeing, the little man vanished. Herbert rushed home to tell her mother, who of course didn't believe her. Then in 1925, a now 35-year-old Mrs. Herbert found herself on the moors of Dartmoor again. She was very familiar with the area now, but she suddenly, for some reason, found herself completely lost. And with no idea of which direction to take, she started to think that she was under the influence of troublesome fairy folk. So she turned her pockets inside out, an old charm said to help ward off fairy magic, and apparently this worked because suddenly everything around her was familiar again, and she was able to finally find her way back home. From Reddit user Kuro Oruk comes her first-hand account with fairies. She writes, "When I was about 20, I was staying at my boyfriend's mom's house one night. I was a little sleep deprived as we'd been out the night before. I decided to go upstairs for a nap and woke up some hours later to darkness. The full moon was shining through the window and suddenly there was rustling and movement everywhere in the room. As I tried to see what it was that was moving, I started to see tiny beings coming from all around the curtains and kind of bungeeing down the glass onto the floor. There were voices and they sounded excited. I sat up, terrified, and made a run for it downstairs. I remember being a little embarrassed to say what had happened to freak me out so much, but when I relayed my story to my boyfriend's mom, she just smiled and told me, oh, that's nothing to worry about. Every morning when I get up, I open the back door and I invite the fairies in." With all that said, any of you had any encounters like this? Please let me know down in the comments. This is very bizarre, but anyway, all that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.